very much to today's lunchtime session. So I am Catherine Edwards. I'm a reader in legal education at Keele University, but for today it's probably more relevant that I'm chair of the Equality, Diversity and Inclusion Committee at Birmingham Law Society. And today I have the pleasure of welcoming my colleague Diane. Diane, are you happy to introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. My name is Diane Blankine. I'm a lecturer here at Keele University. I have research interests surrounding equalities in the legal profession, particularly around the accommodation of Muslim women in the legal profession. So I'm hoping later on in this session, I can just touch upon a little bit of research that I did for my PhD.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Diane. So without further ado, I'm going to tell you a little bit about, oh dear, it's animated, sorry. Mary Elizabeth Pickup. So Mary Elizabeth Pickup qualified as a solicitor in Birmingham 100 years ago. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about her life because it is quite interesting, and why I think she matters to us and where we could use her going forward. And then Diane is going to bring us up to date, looking at intersectionality and specifically her research into Muslim women in the legal profession, which is really interesting. So, just a very brief introduction to Mary Elizabeth Pickup. So this was the only photograph I could find of her. I've relied heavily on two separate sources, the 100 Years Project, which we're all familiar with, and also the wonderful Our Legal Community book by Dr. Sally Hoban, which was a publication that came from the celebration of 200 years of Birmingham Law Society. The wonderful thing about Mary is that she joins the two together. She was one of the first 4 women to take the Law Society finals. Lots and lots of people have spoken about Carrie Morrison, and that's really, really good. But Mary was one of those first 4. And actually, Mary got the top marks. So Mary is exceptional in that, but also her background is important because her family originally came from London and was an example of social mobility. They came from the East End of London and they moved to Wales, her grandfather did, to the Pembroke Dock, and actually did really, really well, to the extent that Mary's family, she came from a middle class background, but the generation before were not middle class. Her father ended up being president of Pembrokeshire Building Society. And because of his work as an engineer, the family was affluent enough for, very unusually, Mary to go to university. Now, in going to university, she didn't go to Oxbridge like some of the others. She went to Aberystwyth University. And then, upon completing her degree, she moved to Birmingham. And she moved to a firm in Birmingham where she married her husband. But when Mary was actually doing the Law Society finals, she already had 2 daughters. So she was working in her husband's practice, studying, doing her Law Society finals, whilst also being a mother. Now, any of us who have done that or supported anybody doing that know what a huge undertaking that is. Yet she got the top mark of the 4 women. She also got a Birmingham Law Society prize for her top marks in the Law Society finals. She got 4 books as part of a gift for the top mark. So that in itself, she was recognised before she qualified for her academic and practical endeavours. Upon passing the Law Society finals, the 4 first women had to also complete their articles. And although Carrie Morrison got to the finish line first, the other 3 were only shortly behind, and they qualified 100 years ago last month. So they all qualified as solicitors in January 1923. And in doing so, Mary became a member of Birmingham Law Society. So she was our first female member as a practicing solicitor. So that in itself was significant as well. But Mary was very heavily involved in the local community. She was a soroptimist, Google it. She did a lot of work with Birmingham Poor Man's Law Society. And when she sadly died, age 57, it was remarked at the Birmingham Law Society AGM about her passing and how much she had done for the local legal community, but also the wider community. She was also mentioned in the Daily Mail in the year of her passing, and there was an obituary to her and about her. And so you can see that Mary Elizabeth Pickup was actually a very significant member of the Birmingham legal community during her life, as well as being one of the pioneering first 4 women to take the Law Society finals. For me, her story is really important because she encapsulates the fact that it doesn't all happen in London, which, as a Londoner, I'm very proud to now be a Midlander. She was one of the first women. She did a lot of pro bono, and Birmingham Law Society is very proud of its record with pro bono. But also when you look at our past female presidents, when you look at their profiles, we have a very good history of strong female presidents, and more coming, and committee chairs. And so for me, Mary is really important because she combines the values as well as the talent in the Birmingham Law Society. So I don't want to just talk about her today, and I'm deliberately not talking about her on International Women's Day when suddenly everybody talks about women in the law. I want to highlight Mary's work now, but I want it to be a starting point for further work. So Diane is very kindly mentoring me in doing some more work in relation to research into Mary, and I want to highlight her more going forward. Also, I would encourage participants today and more widely to look at the Women in Law pledge that the Law Society has. We as a law school at Keele are investigating signing up to the Women in Law pledge, and I'm very happy to share it in the chat later. So I'd like you all to think about and investigate whether that's something that you might be interested in doing, so that today is very much just a starting point of a conversation. And as Guy is indicating, write this down. So without further ado, Diane, shall I allow you to start presenting if I stop sharing? Or do you want me to be your...
I've just requested control. Are my slides on this next?
They are.
Ooh,
Diane now has control.
There we go. Okay. Oh, how do I get on? Okay. Aha! Thank you very much. Thank you, Catherine. That was really interesting. Is everybody all right hearing me? Fantastic. Well, hello everyone. My name's Diane Blenkiron. As I said before, I'm a lecturer at Keele University, and I'm really honoured to have been invited to this event. I think it's absolutely fantastic. and a celebration of how far we've come as women since that initial, those initial trailblazers in the 1900s. I also feel like it's a recognition that there are significant issues that are still facing the full accommodation and participation of women today. But today, as indicated in the title, I wanted to discuss a particular group of women whose experiences are often unheard when we talk about women, and that is Muslim women. Now, this was a focus of my PhD research a couple of years ago, and it's a topic that I'm really passionate about. Now, I can't do much justice to their voices in 20 minutes, but as Catherine said, it's really about getting the conversation going. And I just wanted to give a taster of some of the, for want of a better word, challenges that are still facing some of the participants that I interviewed in my study. I'd also be really grateful for your feedback, because the PhD is complete, but this work is by no means complete, and I want it to go further. And I'd love it to spark some future conversations about how we accommodate these voices. I'm just, there we go. Sorry, gone too far. I've kind of hinted at this already, and Catherine talked about intersectionality, but I just wanted to reinforce why I think this issue is so important. And that is, the reasoning is very much based in this recognition of intersectionality. Now, forgive me if you're already familiar with this term. I just wanted to explain my interpretation of that and how it relates to this work. So intersectionality is attributed to an American Black lawyer called Kimberly Crenshaw. She first talked about it in 1989 regarding a US employment case. And it's this recognition that we all have multifaceted identities. We all have different identity markers, such as sex, race, religion, socioeconomic class, and sexuality. And it's a recognition that all of these overlap and contribute to how we perceive, how we move through the world, and in turn, how we are perceived and treated in the world by others. And I like this quote from Audre Lorde, who says that there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we don't live single issue lives. None of us could really describe our identity as being solely as a woman or as a man. Our identities, again, they're multifaceted. So when we talk about women as a whole in research or at events, it's never going to provide an adequate picture of, for example, the struggles facing working class women, of the struggles that are facing Black women, of some of the issues that are facing Muslim women, because we're thinking about it on a single axis. And I feel like we need to move away from that. So what I'm hoping my research will do is to help move away from that and to hopefully help amplify these voices which have been missing in current research. Now, secondly, just as a bit of a precursor to me presenting some of the quotations from my participants, I wanted to just define what I mean when I say Muslim. Now, all Muslims will have a different understanding and interpretation of this word and a relationship with this term. I'm not a Muslim, so I don't really feel like I can chip into that debate on a personal level. I'm quite persuaded by the argument by Maudud and Mir, who talk about Muslimness, for want of a better term, can be thought of as a sort of quasi-ethnicity. And this is similar to how we view Jewishness in this culture, or how we view Sikhism, which are both protected by racial discrimination law. And it sounds strange, but a really good way I found of explaining this is via a joke made by an Irish comedian, Dara O'Brien. I don't know if you've heard of him. He used to present Mock the Week. And he says, you know, if you ask an Irish person, are you a Catholic or are you a Protestant? And they say, oh, no, I'm an atheist. It makes sense to kind of go back to them and say, ah, yes, but are you a Catholic atheist or a Protestant atheist? Somehow that still makes sense, even though that belief in God is missing. And in the same way, I kind of see how this is a reflection of Islamic cultural tradition, which can permeate and remain important in Muslims' lives, despite them having various degrees of religiosity or personal piety. So in a way, having Muslimness defined as a quasi-ethnicity, it can help join secular or atheist Muslims, along with their liberal, moderate and conservative counterparts. I think also it's important in underpinning almost a shared experience by Muslims in our culture as well. One that is, if we're being honest about it, been quite hostile to Muslims for a very long time. I mean, this is a society where a former prime minister thought it was completely okay to make the jokes comparing Muslim women who wear the niqab to letterboxes or postboxes. And unfortunately, to be blunt, things haven't got much better post-Brexit either. Now, one of the major issues that came out of my research was focused around the profession's demands for socialising and networking. Now, it might be completely different at your firm, and I think it varies from firm to firm. But on the whole, research into the legal profession, both actually the barrister's profession and the solicitor's profession, have demonstrated that socialising and networking events remain a core feature of professional life. This isn't something that's exclusive to the legal profession. It's not something that's special about the legal profession. It actually is something that's shared by most professions, I would say, and quite a lot of workplaces as well. And these events, they serve a purpose. They serve a good purpose. So they're important for building networks and relationships with other practitioners, with management and with clients. And they also have a clear link to progressionary opportunities as well. Now, working at a university as a lecturer, I can kind of safely say this starts really early as well. Even at university level, these events are often set up which enable students to seek out those early connections, to get access to work experience, which is really important if they don't come from a family where they have those connections built up already. So some of these issues start right at the beginning of a lawyer's career. Now, we also know traditionally these events, these spaces were male spaces. Women for a very long time were completely excluded from these men's rooms. Now, obviously, that's not true today. Women aren't excluded from these, but sometimes they're still not spaces where women feel comfortable in, especially not spending a long period of time in there or with any regularity. They continue to be described as being hypermasculine, with prevalent laddish kind of behaviour. Casual racism, casual sexism tends to still be prevalent. And also they tend to be alcohol dominated as well. They tend to revolve around the consumption of alcohol as a bit of a social lubricant. And that's a reflection of British culture as a whole, I would say. So we know the importance of these events in terms of forging relationships, but what I guess we haven't really spoken about is what is the impact of these on particular groups. So for example, Muslims and Muslim women in particular, who statistically have a lower rate of alcohol consumption than wider general British society. Now, this was a prevalent issue in terms of my research. Sorry, I'm trying to get the slides to move and they're not. There we go. So this was a prevalent issue that was brought up in my research. Interesting, all of my participants said that they didn't drink. And there was two strategies that were broadly represented by the participants. I've called the first one active participation. So this group of participants felt able to participate, sometimes even happy to participate in these events, regardless of where they were or whether they were revolving around alcohol or not. So you can see an example of Halima on the top left. She said, you know, I'm happy to participate because it's the firm that I'm working for and I want the best for it. Again, Parveen on the bottom right of your screen, she says, you know, I don't think my religion is a bar to anything, and I don't think it's good to use that as an excuse. Now, some participants were a bit more cautious. You know, I'll be happy to participate and I'm not going to drink, but I'm going to be a bit more cautious about revealing the reasons why I don't drink. So Razia on the top right, she said, I don't drink, but I never say it's because I'm a Muslim. Now, I do wonder whether this cautiousness would be shared by a non-Muslim non-drinker, but I think that's open to interpretation. So those are the people that were kind of happy to actively participate. Some weren't so happy to actively participate, but felt like they should do so for the sake of their career. But to kind of protect themselves, they almost put boundaries in place. A really common one was in enforcing time limits in terms of how long they were going to spend in these kind of environments. So you can see an example of Nosheen on the bottom left. She said, I made a decision in my head that I'm not going to stay for that long because, people start getting drunk and I don't like it at that point. At that point, that's my boundary. That's when it's time to leave. I'm not completely comfortable, but for the sake of my career, I'm going to push my discomfort to one side. Oh, I'm sorry, I've mucked this up again. Forgive me. What is staggering, though, was the amount of reports by the participants about the pressure to drink at some of these events. It's almost like, it's great that you're attending, it's an expectation, but it's not enough. You should also be participating in drinking as well. How this affected participants was really varied. So for some of them, they could just laugh it off. It didn't bother them that much. But for some, this constant pressure to drink was actually quite upsetting. So Razia on the left, she was able to laugh off some, quite frankly, ridiculous remarks that were made to her by her superior. And she said, the CEO, he was really fascinated by the fact that I didn't drink. And he kept saying that to me. And at the time, I just laughed about it because I'm quite laid back. But one of my friends, she said, do you not find it offensive that he was saying, oh, I'll give you a promotion if you drink? And I was like, no. But for some, this pressures can be actually quite overwhelming, such as Miriam on the right. And she said, it's one comment that upset me, which was when I first started, which was, why don't you drink? Because it was my joining drinks. And I was like, no, I don't drink. You don't drink? Oh, I would have never hired you then. And it was that sort of off the cuff remark that I just thought, oh, how interesting. And that left her really upset and wondering whether her worth was just based around the fact that she was able to socialize and to integrate as one of them. And it actually got to the extent that she felt like she had to conceal the fact that she was a non-drinker at subsequent events, just as a temporary display of outward conformity to these norms. So she said, what I've done at this firm is rather than getting so much pressure to drink, a colleague even poured me a glass of wine and I literally held it in my hand all evening just to have the impression of drinking, which I found ridiculous. I think one participant really summed this up when she said to me, the pressure of the social circle is so great. I think it depends on how much you're willing to give up in order to conform to the profession. Now, for some, this is just absolutely non-negotiable. For some participants, this wasn't a thing that they felt able to do. The strength of their religious or cultural convictions meant they could not reconcile the two together. So, for example, Anissa on the left-hand side, she talked about her refusal to attend and how she foresaw it as negatively impacting her progression into the profession. So she said, I don't go out on Friday nights there or out anytime. And all of these things will stop you getting closer to management. And if there's any promotion coming, because you were never with them, you were never in their mind. And I really empathise with this point because on a personal level, I'm a teetotal and I generally try and stay away from events where alcohol is being consumed, particularly in excess, mainly because I think if anybody is a non-drinker in the audience, you'll empathise with me here as well. It can just be really uncomfortable being around people that are slowly getting drunk. However, I also acknowledge I'm a white Christian woman. So my teetotalism might be perceived as being a bit odd, but I'm a bit boring, a bit antisocial. I'm not going to deny any of those claims, but it's still falling within the range of acceptable Britishness. For Muslim women, non-participating has the potential to highlight their difference sometimes, their lack of fit, or perhaps even highlighting an overall otherness to the white British norm. And this can be really harmful, not only to her, but to the wider community as a whole. And it was Sana who explained this really, really well to me, because she said, you know, if I was white, it might be a different story if I said, oh, I don't drink. But if I say, oh, I don't drink, it's immediately bringing back the, you know, oh, culturally she's restricted, religiously she's restricted. So for me, for Diane, I might be just a bit of a dullard that doesn't drink. For Sana, she was saying, it's automatically going back to that assumption. It's because of her religion that she's being restricted, or it's because of her culture that she's having her freedoms restricted. Apologies, Catherine, I'm having a bit of trouble with these slides. Oh, thank you. Now, I could talk about the issues surrounding socialization and networking events forever, but you know, we're kind of time limited. So there's a couple of other issues that I wanted to talk about. And please forgive me, I'm going to have to race through them a little bit quickly, but I just, again, wanted to get the conversation going. So another issue that participants talked about was concern over any visible expression of religious adherence. Now, there's a quote at the top of your screen that says, "Don't be too outwardly Islamic." And this was some well-meaning advice given by a father to a young practitioner. Like I said, it was well-meaning. He did it out of concern for her safety and for also the benefit of her future career. Now, one of the issues that was raised, and you might think about when we're talking about visible religious expression, is the idea of religious dress. Dress is already a gendered issue in terms of the profession. So we as women already walk this tightrope to have this dual expectation of both looking feminine, looking like women, but also to almost desexualize our bodies. We can't look too sexy. We can't show any racialized markers either. We almost have to kind of bleach out our identity. And we're also expected to project the look that's expected of us by our firms. Now, this can be difficult for some of the participants who adopted the hijab. So Miriam, who's on your screen, in particular talks about how for her and for her firm, she thought the hijab projected an undesirable image. She was working in a commercial firm down in London, and unfortunately, this wasn't just in her head. This was reflected by her boss's statements to her about the way she looked. She said, "My boss has actually said to me, I hired you mainly because of the way you look, because of the way you talk, and because of your personality. And I'm always at functions or events or networking or at shows." And I think in her mind, she had an image of that person she wanted to go out and do that. And that person wasn't with a headscarf. So her image was desirable for her firm and for her clientele. And she thought that the appearance of a headscarf might scupper that image. And this was really difficult personally for this woman. She confided in me afterwards that she'd just given birth to her first child, and she felt a really strong pull towards her faith, a renewed pull towards her faith. She actually wanted to adopt the headscarf after this, but she just felt unable to reconcile it with this established professional identity. And this eventually ended up in her feeling quite strong feelings of shame regarding this. And Taiba talked about on the right how the hijab was potentially threatening to some people, clients, colleagues. It was almost as if some people would think it would interfere with the way in which she dealt with them, either for a good reason or for a bad reason as well. Now, following on from this idea of being outwardly Islamic, another area of concern was the visibility of prayer for religious women. So for some practicing Muslims, they have a requirement to pray ritual prayer 5 times a day, 2 of which might fall within the average working day. And this naturally raises practical issues for women that wanted to pray at work. Now, some firms were really accommodating and didn't see it as an issue, which was fantastic. A lot of participants stated that one of the merits, for example, of working at firms where they had Muslim colleagues or they had partners that shared their faith, this wasn't an issue because adequate time and space was provided to them. They didn't really have to ask and they didn't really have to justify it either. For the majority, though, the question had to be broached with the management. Now, one participant, Razia, on the left-hand side of your screen, was met by what I think was supposed to be a positive response, because she said, I said to my associate, by the way, I pray. And she said, I don't care if you snort cocaine. I really don't, as long as your work is good. I can't help wonder why the associate made the connection between prayer and illicit drug use, but there you go. For some like Tiber and Sana, they wanted to pray, but they talked about fearing the responses from colleagues. So Tiber said, you know, I do prioritize prayers, but sometimes I feel if I said to someone in the office, they'd just be like, oh my God, that's just weird, or that's just extreme. So for Tiber, there's a risk that if she asked, her colleagues would maybe feel differently about her, maybe even think she was extreme in her religious views, which, you know, is a stereotype that's kind of bordering on quite dangerous for her. And Sana felt like it would expose her even more as an outsider if she actually asked. So she said, you know, to be honest with you, I don't know whether I'd have the nerve to do it or ask to, because I'd feel like all eyes were on me. Another major issue was actually the lack of available facilities, clean private facilities that were suitable for its use. So Miriam described being given a glass meeting room in the middle of an open plan office to go and pray. She said, you know, people saw her do it and she knows that they found it really bizarre. So that's completely not acceptable. Some of the participants have come up with some more imaginative strategies to get around this. So I had one participant saying she prayed in her car when she could. For some of the younger participants, praying at home, catching up on your prayers was an option and was completely acceptable under, you know, the Islamic doctrine of necessity. But as women start taking on caring responsibilities or start having children, that strategy of catching up on your prayers in the evening becomes increasingly difficult. And again, I can empathise this. I've got a 22-month-old son, and last night I had approximately 0 minutes downtime from the time that I put him to bed to the time that I went to bed as well. So I don't think that's an alternative really that's viable. Thank you, Catherine. I appreciate this. So these are really, really big areas up for discussion, and much more research is needed and much more time needs to be dedicated into hearing these experiences. But there are a few things that I hope that we can maybe take away from this session. First of all, overall, I really hope that this will highlight the need to make sure that we're including all women in our discussions and our conversations, not just the dominant voices which have been heard for years. On a practical level, I think we need to start looking at alternatives to socializing events which aren't alcohol-based or based around bar-type situations. And these shouldn't be tokenistic either. So this is something that we're trying to do on a university level at Keele University. We're having a look at spaces in which we can provide for our students to go and make connections, to go and obtain future work experience, which aren't around alcohol. Private, clean, suitable spaces need to be provided for. I mean, I would modify this, and people that want to pray, religious people that want to pray. And I don't think this is going to be too arduous because, you know, women have hard earned the right to clean private spaces for breastfeeding. So I don't see why the equivalent shouldn't be offered to people who need to pray. Finally, I think it's also a call for the increased representation of Muslim women in the profession, especially for more junior professionals, for some of my students that talk to me about their concerns, for them to aspire to, particularly representations of visible, successful Muslim women. And I just wanted to leave you a quote. Catherine, could you, at risk of sounding like Chris Whitty, could you go on to the next slide, please? I just wanted to leave you a quote from this young participant, Sana, about hope. And she said, I mean, how many times do I see a solicitor with a hijab on one of the Magic Circle law firm's front pages? How many times do I see that? That's a practicing Muslim woman. How often have I seen that? Have you ever seen it? I've never seen it. If I'd have seen it, I would have printed it off and kept it. So I hope she saw this image of Rafia Arshad, who is the first woman hijabi judge. This was published in BBC News. It was also picked up and covered by Vogue as well. And I hope she printed it off and I hope she kept it. Thank you very much. I'd be very happy to answer any questions or listen to some of your feedback in terms of future directions for research as well. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Diane. That was really, really interesting and thought-provoking. So we've had quite a few comments in the chat. And I think Sarah, our colleague, raises a good one. As someone who advises students, it's important to equip students for these conversations. Absolutely. Does anyone have any questions they'd like to raise in the chat that I can field? So far, the Padlet is looking very pretty with the cherry blossom, but is rather clear.
Catherine, can I just address a couple of comments that I've seen on the chat as well? Because Rebecca talks about she thinks that networking is a gendered issue, and I absolutely agree as well. So this isn't just an issue that's facing Muslim women, it's also affecting women who have caring responsibilities. And we know in society that women are predominantly carers for other family members and for children. And she says, you know, women can't keep up with this as a whole. And I think that's a really, really good point. And Sarah kind of makes a connected point about people with disabilities or medical conditions that can't drink safely. So it's about inclusion for everyone. Alice, even, you know, where you go to these kind of events, the only alternative that's offered to you is water to wine. And again, it's almost like it's not providing full participation for us. This is the standard, and if you kind of deviate against that, well, it's just water, because I think it's highlighting the kind of bizarreness of being teetotal at these events. Sorry, I just wanted to discuss some of those chat comments.
I think Nadia raises a really good point, and one that we've been addressing, starting point needing to be at university and being put off joining the Law Society because it was all pub crawls. So we've got a networking event next week, which is kindly being hosted by Number 5 Chambers, and that's alcohol free. And because we understand the financial pressures, we're reimbursing travel expenses. So, and if anyone's struggling, any of our students will buy their travel for them. So that we're trying to remove as many barriers as possible. Does anyone have any other comments or want to say anything?
I think that's a really important point that Nadia's kind of raised. And this is something that I mentioned in the talk about not being tokenistic either, because I remember at university, someone mentioned having an alternative to these networking events as like a pizza night or a socializing night, but socializing with other students, not being given the opportunity to socialize with professionals. So these events have to be quite meaningful if we're putting them on and they're going to be alcohol free.
And terribly, I've forgotten that tomorrow night we're also doing one on campus, which is alcohol free and does involve pizza actually. But it's with professionals. Again, it's not just students, but we're pitching it at different levels of professionals to sort of try and ease the students into networking, but it is alcohol free. Any other comments? Is anyone willing to share experiences? That's a really good point, Rebecca. I was wondering if you did any research surrounding religious fasting and networking.
So I had a few participants that touched upon the idea of religious fasting and the impact that that might have in terms of networking. So some people, again, you talk about some people have avoided certain networking sessions if they fell within, the areas a day where they were fasting. I did have one participant talk about how the demands on her placed as a criminal lawyer post legal aid changes, and how she was having to work day and night throughout Ramadan. So without food during the day, trying to finish off a case for a measly small fee afterwards. So it has been raised by participants. I'm yet to do any kind of in-depth kind of research about it though.
But it's an idea for the future. Alice raises an issue about the timing of networking. This is deliberately a lunchtime event. I know that for some it means that you might be eating your lunch whilst doing this, you might be playing us in the background, but we're also recording it so that people can come back to this discussion, and it will be as accessible as we can make it for everyone. But yeah, nighttime networking events, not great when you've got children, although sometimes it's a great excuse to escape the children. So Sarah's point, creating an inclusive environment for all our students is critical to create a level playing field and allow the best talent to come through to legal professions. Totally agree, Sarah, but then we tend to agree. See it to be it. How can we raise the profile of successful Muslim female lawyers? Totally agree, Rebecca. We're doing a lot, or I'm trying to do a lot with role modeling. I think it's really, really important that people share their stories so that younger generations, but also those in the profession, can aspire not just to be that person, but to understand the challenges they've faced and that they are not exceptional to overcome it. It's, look, I'm normal. This is what I've managed to do. Anybody can do it. It's not that I'm special. It's that this is where I've got to. And I think that's important at all levels, but particularly with women, and certainly with intersectionality. Diane, do you want to come in on that at all? I mean, you've spoken about Sana, and I think that last slide
Yeah,
is really telling.
I'm always careful to kind of not overstep the mark in terms of speaking for this group of people. That's why I'm just here to kind of present and try and contextualize the experiences of the participants that very kindly spoke to me. Some of the things that the participants raised with me, and I'm making kind of no judgment in terms of how well they would work, but they raised the issue of role models. A few of my participants came from families where none of their parents or extended family members were from the profession. So that was a really important thing, actually, that they aspired to be, was to fulfill that role model gap that they didn't have. Like I said, Sana, who's the young LPC student, said, recruitment literature. But again, it's got to not be tokenistic in that regard. But, just seeing people that look like her, maybe people wearing the hijab in the recruitment material would send a clear signal that, that's somewhere that she feels like she could fit in. So those are the two kind of things that people spoke to me about, the participants spoke to me about increasing representation.
I think Sally Ann's point, let's be honest, this will not take anything radical. It takes leaders to step up and lead by example. So this brings me back to the Women in Law Pledge, because that's exactly what it is. It's firms pledging to lead by example, but to have fairness. And shouldn't we all be aspiring to that, to recognise the challenges and have fair practices? Rebecca, I'm going to be really mean, but because I know you're on the call and I know you've been doing some work with some female leaders, I think the role modelling is really important, and I think your article will be really helpful Are you willing to share a little?
That's so mean. I've got no makeup on.
You don't need to turn your camera on. You don't need to turn your camera on, I promise.
Oh, well, yeah, it is fascinating. What particularly did you want to know, Catherine? Because the reason I got involved was because I felt inadequate and uneducated in this area. So I'm not so sure I can shed any more light on it, but I was fascinated by what I've learned, really. What was it in particular you were thinking about?
It was the fact that you, in writing this article for the Birmingham Law Society Bulletin, that you were able to reach out and get a group of senior leaders in quite a diverse range of law firms. And it was a collaborative sharing of practice. It was not a competitive discussion. It was really empowering.
It was absolutely incredible. Unbelievable. I mean, I couldn't believe it. I just put on a group of, I wanted to expand my knowledge. And so I put a note on LinkedIn to say, would love to know what you're doing in your practices, because I was mindful that we know about the problems. And I wanted to know what, companies were doing, firms were doing as solutions, so that I could share that. And we are funny, aren't we? We try and be very competitive and keep our cards close to our chest. And actually, if we just share our best practice, and when we're setting an example, not just that we're doing it, but also that it's possible. It is possible to allow prayer time. It's not going to reduce billable hours. It's not going to make the company lose profit if you have networking once a month at lunchtime. So I had, oh my goodness, Sarah Walker-Smith, CEO of AMPA, Stephanie Perroton from Squire Patton Boggs, Claire Collins from DWF, Erwin Mitchell weren't able to send somebody, Shoesmiths, Fiona Teague, Naomi Pride, Lawyer of the Year in 21. So all these women just said, well, and actually John Worrell as well, wonderful man at Trowers and Hamlin, said, happy to jump on a call. I never even asked for the call, but we had it. And yes, you're right. It was so empowering listening to everybody sharing their best practice, not just looking at the negatives, but thinking, right, what can we do? And it was really an uplifting call, wasn't it, Catherine? And it was wonderful to have you there as well. And just so wonderful that people are willing to share. And I think we need to do that more often. That's why I talked about raising the profile, because I think unless we can see it out there, nobody in the authority gap, she says, no one anymore looks at a woman driving and goes, gosh, look at that woman driving a car. But in the 1950s, that would have been a huge, obvious statement. I think we need the more examples we have out there, then the easier closing that gap will be for us. But this has been fascinating, Diane, because I hadn't thought about, in detail, in such detail that you've eloquently put forward. The intersectionality as well is a big issue. So thank you so much.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Rebecca, and sorry to put you on the spot. She'll never invite me to anything again, or come to anything I do. So let's look at how we take this forward. Today has been a really interesting conversation, and we've had 50 people on this call. So that tells me that people are interested. So what's next? Well, I'm going to do a monthly article in the Birmingham Law Society Bulletin. I would really like to do these meetings regularly to share good practice from an equality, diversity and inclusion point of view. I'd also like to do a punt for Diane, because Diane, it's been really, really interesting. Thank you so much. And I think this is something that with my EDI hat on, I'd really like to take your research further. I know the way universities work, and I know we've got to get some funding, but I would hope that there might be people on the call who are interested in participating in something going forward. So watch this space. If people are interested, I'm also recruiting for the EDI committee. We have vacancies on the gender subcommittee. So if anybody's interested, all you have to be is enthusiastic and willing to put some hard work in, male or female. Likewise, we've had some recent recruitment exercises for others, but I'll be talking about this more going forward. I would like this to just be the start of a conversation. So do keep in touch with us. Diane?
Yeah, can I just jump in on that point in terms of going forward? I would like to bring it forward, and I'd be really, really interested in if anybody has any personal experience that they would want to share in the context of research, because I am very aware in terms of disclosure that these are not my experiences, and I can only use my voice to kind of contextualize and amplify this. So I think it would be very gratefully received, even if you wanted to say, you know, I don't recognize anything that you just said as my experience, because that needs to be heard. But likewise, if you have sympathies with some of these kind of struggles that the participants were talking about, that needs to be heard. And the more that we can do to try and lift up these voices, because like I said, we've been doing research into women solicitors for, I think, the biggest part of 30 years now. And my work was some of the first work to actually speak to this subset of women. And I think that's really shocking and quite shameful, really.
Definitely. So I've popped my email address down there. Hopefully Diane can do likewise. I'm sure Jess will be sending you a feedback form. So if you do want to get in touch, I'll ask if Diane's email address can be added to that, Jess. Thank you all very much for giving up your lunch hours. And if anyone wants to follow up afterwards, we'd be really interested. Okay, thanks very much all. Bye.